Hello and welcome to another Aziz podcast. Today we're diving into the role of coaching in shaping the leaders of tomorrow, leaders who are purposeful, human and sustainable. And I'm thrilled to be joined by two incredible coaches, Caroline Hughes and Jeremy Keeley. They bring unique perspectives on this topic, so let's meet them. Jeremy, a bit about yourself.
Thanks, Khalid. Well, I regard myself as a developmental facilitator, helping people to be the best they can be, both as individuals and as teams. I'm also an executive coach. Predominantly, I've been doing this since about 1991, 92. And I guess I also regard myself as quite simple because I like people to use the tools and techniques that I use. It's related to this conversation, I think, to be able to use them on themselves and therefore don't want to make them too complex. But also not because I don't believe particularly bright. But yeah, so simple facilitator and coach. Thank you.
Good. Caroline, tell us about you.
Yeah, thank you, Khalid. I'm based in Dublin in Ireland, and I set up my coaching business 5 years ago when I left corporate roles. So I sometimes consider myself the been there, done that leader, and then other times step really comfortably into coaching and facilitation. And I love particularly working with leaders in those career transitions and really helping them to recognize that whatever got them here, they'll need to enhance in order to go to the next level.
So let's kick off with our first topic. So coaching these days has changed a great deal, particularly when it comes to coaching for new leaders and leaders that are coming up through the pipeline. What sort of changes have you seen, Caroline?
Well, I guess I've seen, I suppose, the democratization of coaching being a very big change recently. Like it used to be that coaching was for top executives, that you nearly had to give a kidney in order to get a coach. And we kind of see that changing now, don't we? And we also see the influence of AI and chatbot and how people are much more able to self-serve and kind of go through some of that kind of Socratic inquiry with an AI tool around an action or a strategy. So what I see more and more in my client base is when they come into the space for coaching, it's more about looking for personal insight where they can't get that necessarily through using an AI tool or reading a book. And it's more in the space of personal exploration of who am I and why should anyone be led by me? And I love that question, particularly for a new leader, because they're navigating that transition of potentially having been a peer and now they're managing and leading the people they used to, socialize with and, been at each other's weddings and then feeling the shift in the dynamic. And so I see, particularly in leaders with transition, that becomes increasing talking point was, can I be somewhere that it's safe for me to be vulnerable, to say what's not working, where I don't have to manage a conversation so that you won't think ill of me and my career, like you can in an internal organization.
It's very hard, isn't it, to use probably an unfashionable saying, but it's very hard to run with the hare and hunt with the hounds. And it's the loneliness of command.
That's it.
And this has been around for a long, long time in the Royal Navy. The captain always dines alone unless he is invited by the other officers into the wardroom. Otherwise, he takes his meal in his day cabin, and that's what he does, which is an interesting one, isn't it? It's the loneliness of command. Jeremy, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think obviously there are a lot more coaches around, and therefore I think either it's easier to get one at one level, democratization that Caroline's talking about, and also harder to choose actually because there's a lot of people trying to sell themselves. I think that what has grown over the last few years, many years, is the recognition that coaching is valuable. So more and more recognition by leaders that having a coach is not a weakness or a remedy of a problem, but actually genuinely helps them. I think there's a growth in accreditation from my recognition over the lot since I trained properly in 98. Accreditation has become much more important than it was then. And AI, as you talk about this, I mean, there's such a thing as an AI coach now. I think the other thing is that I think that coaching has shifted more recently into being also helping with an agenda for the world. So I'm noticing people are more interested in sustainability, climate change type sustainability and social. And it's okay now more to ask questions around that, not to be righteous or anything, but what kind of ancestor do you want to be is actually a very valid question now in coaching for me. Related to purpose, so there's a lot more of that. I think fundamentally, though, if I go back to 91, 92, 93 and read The Inner Game of Tennis by Tim Gallwey and stuff, fundamentally, I think coaching has stayed the same. It's helping people to be the very best they can be, and it just, some of it's shifted, but some of it's fundamentally the same, I think, as well.
Yeah, I mean, one trend I've seen is for some people some managements to say, well, I'll be the coach, I'll coach people. And of course, you see the color draining from the faces of the people who are facing being coached by their boss. They find that very challenging, and it's not universally regarded as a safe space for them. So not so easy, but mentoring I often think can come from within a business, but the person doing the mentoring has to be so far removed from that individual, so they can say something that might otherwise be career limiting, and know that there'll be no fear of reprisals or repercussions or whatever. Yeah, okay, I get that. So coaching to coach, you often talk about that, Jeremy. What are you actually looking at?
Well, okay, so in broad terms, you've got a leader has got to have certain types of conversations with their people. So one might be the task of the organization, what I call management, delivering. Are you delivering? Are you not delivering? One has got to be kind of inspiration. What can I motivate? Can I give meaning to this work? Can I create the safety around which this work can be done? One is a well-being, more and more the well-being of the people working for them, and inclusion, for example, into this space, a sense of belonging. And one is about a context, always awake to the context that's changing constantly. And then into that space is development, their people learning, their leaders develop underneath them developing. So that's where predominantly I think that leaders who are able to bring coaching techniques and coaching styles can support. So I hear what you say, Khaled. Actually, that doesn't mean to say that I have to, when I've got my leader as a coach, that I'm constantly having to tell them stuff that I probably wouldn't ever want to tell them. But if a leader can bring questions, enabling questions, and that type of stuff, that for me means leadership as a coach. A leader as a coach. It really helping the person to think for themselves what it is they need to be better at and how they might develop that skill at the same time as the balance of all the other things they've got to talk about.
Caroline, if I'm a manager, possibly in the C-suite or next level below, and I've been told I have to become a coach, one of the issues for some is self-awareness. How do you develop self-awareness?
Yeah, I think when most leaders are asked to become a coach, particularly more senior, they think it's about solving for other people. And I suppose what I kind of notice most often is that when we start the conversation about self-awareness, it has to start with this separation between how the mind works and how we think it works. So we think typically that we see reality as it is. We don't typically step back and realize actually our minds are more like projectors than they are VCR recorders of old. And how we experience a situation is very much based on our previous experience, our beliefs, and our assumptions. So what I start with typically is, for any situation, we draw two circles. And in the first circle, we call it the situation. And we write down the facts, the indisputable facts that anyone who was involved would agree. The meeting was at 8:00. There was 3 people in it. The topic was this, right? And then in the second circle, we write down what's the story that we're telling ourselves about this situation. And it's when we begin to separate the meaning we're giving it, or the story that's based on our prior experience, our assumptions on the world, the beliefs we have about ourselves and others, we can begin to see how differing perspectives emerge. And we begin to see what's shaping our own stories, what's shaping our own worldview. And I think that's very often the first step in becoming more aware that, it's that phrase, I don't know who said it first, we don't see the world as it is, we see it as we are. Because from there, we can have curiosity around other people's perspective. And Jeremy mentioned inclusion earlier. It's very difficult to think about being inclusive when, again, we are insistent that our view is the only view, or it's the right view. And so self-awareness allows us to kind of separate that compression between what we think happened and what's indisputable, and that kind of puts us at freedom around the choices we want to make.
Yes, I mean, and also, you ever so senior, being able to admit that you don't have all the answers is really, really important. I mean, that level of self-awareness. A friend of mine is a retired general, was giving a speech about Putin, and during the question and answer session, somebody said something about the situation in Ukraine, and in particular in relation to the oil business and how it was really working. He was an qualified oil person. And there's this man who's had one of the most senior jobs, not just in the British Army, but in Europe. And he just said, I didn't know that. I've learned something, and thank you. I mean, that's a big man to be able to do that. And again, in the organization, that actually ideas can come from anywhere. Knowledge does not reside necessarily at the top of the organization. Jeremy, anything to add on that?
I think what you just said, actually, we talked in an earlier one about sustainable leadership. But if I can't learn from the people that work for me, if I can't recognize their ability to contribute something that I'm not able to do, then that puts a pressure on me. And that leads to things like burnout and all of those sorts of things. That would be.
And burnout,
but yes,
it's actually added to by the general jitteriness that there is in the world as it is. So difficult to predict what's happening next, and so on. It's almost like we've got to put an arm around our people, but that's easy to say. Practical ways of doing it. Any thoughts, Jeremy?
Practical ways of really supporting people
and a feeling of
that are working for me.
And love, again, we go back to this love thing that we've talked about in previous podcasts, the 4-letter word that dare not speak its name,
I think it has to start for me with helping, almost a bit like what Caroline was saying about the story I'm telling myself vis-a-vis the facts that are going on. It has to start with me as a leader paying real attention to the role and the position that the person I'm working with holds me in. What's the story they're telling themselves when they're with me? Because that's either going to enable a conversation or it's going to get in the way of a conversation. And then my own, being really awake to my own judgments, my own interpretations, my own habitual reactions to something before I go into a conversation. Because it comes back to this awareness thing, doesn't it? So if I can do those two things together, and then, yes, come back to love. Am I operating genuinely in the interests of the person sitting in front of me and in the interests of the organization? And can I somehow bring those two together and not lose myself in that space, and not become a martyr or because that doesn't support anybody either. So you've got to hold all of these three things in balance. Yeah. So come back to love. I mean, it does come back to, can I really help this person to realize that actually I'm coming with genuine care for them, for the organization, for the planet, and for myself, and hold those things in balance? The one thing I'm interested in that's been stirred by this conversation is vulnerability, by the way. And I think there's a danger with the agenda of vulnerability that leaders feel they have to be vulnerable. And that loses authenticity. Because if they're not, then it comes across as inauthentic. But much more to be aware of where I am vulnerable and then to choose whether I share that or not. But in the choice, recognizing that the more I share, the more they're going to get to know me. But I've also got a choice. I don't want to make them feel completely scared in the environment that you're talking about, Kelly. I mean, it could be really quite a scary environment, and I don't want to frighten them off. So I think vulnerability is a really interesting topic here. For senior leaders.
Yes, and leading on from that, I know, Caroline, a lot of people in leadership and development roles and HR roles watch our podcasts. And I can hear them saying, that's all very well, but you should see the CEO here. And, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink, And what resistances are you seeing, and how do you overcome them? How do you give us some tips on overcoming the classic resistances to being more empathetic, more compassionate, more loving, I suppose?
I think every leader I've ever worked with will come from a place of, I'm quite good at this, but the person upstairs, not so much. And of course, when I meet their team, they also have the same narrative very often. So what I think about here is what will best serve the people who work with you. Because I said on another podcast this adage that I have of, when we lead with and through others, because everything gets done with and through others. Because otherwise, you're running a solo game. So I encourage leaders to take ownership of their own state. So regardless of what the CEO is like or what their boss is like, whatever they are in the organization structure, is how do you step into empowerment for the environment you want to create for your team, and let your team be the example of how it can be. Because otherwise we're encouraging almost a victim type of mentality, that there's nothing that can be done around here because someone else won't change. I really encourage leaders to step into their own power and go, what do I want? What's the legacy I want to have? What's the narrative I want my team saying about what it's like to work in this organization? Because I think it's Stephen Covey who says, that the line of sight is always to the closest leader to you, not necessarily to the CEO or the C-suite, if that's not your kind of direct line.
Yeah. Well, we're coming towards the end of our podcast now, and I suppose we're very good at handing down tablets of stone from the mountainside here, but we also talk about ourselves as coaches. How have we really evolved? Because all I've seen in the 40+ years Aziz Corporate's been going is that it's got much tougher out there. It's really hard. I mean, somebody once said to me, "Oh, we're in business, but it's really hard to make any money these days because it's very, very difficult. Everybody's at you." So how have we evolved as coaches to cope with all those things? Some final thoughts, Jeremy?
I think we have to care less about it being a business and care more about the people that we're working with really growing. And we have to bring love to the work. I describe myself as providing loving company while people work on themselves in a way. And we have to bring challenge. I think there's much more challenging limiting beliefs, those types of things, giving feedback directly where we experience somebody being unhelpful in a way that hopefully they can trust us that we're coming with really good intention for them. We have to very carefully navigate the boundary between therapy and coaching, and between mentoring and coaching. It's so often people say to us, well, give me some advice. How often does that happen? Or tell me how we might do this, or you easily could get caught up in that.
I think coaching is about offering people a way back to themselves. The first question I ask anyone who comes to me for coaching is, what is it you want to create? What's the possibility that you want me to take a stand for while you work your way through the process of getting there? And I think when we show up in service like that, and we allow an openness of a conversation that perhaps is the conversation that they can't have anywhere else, then I think that's how coaching is continuing to getting increasingly valued, notwithstanding Jeremy's comment earlier that there are more coaches for sure. But I think when we stand for possibility and connect people to the faith they have in themselves, what they want, well, then that's a conversation that possibly never happens anywhere else outside of the coaching conversation.
I suppose one of the many definitions we hear about coaches is that they are critical friends, but we probably need to be less critical and more friends, and certainly be critical in a more friendly way. That's the important thing. Good. Well, thank you both. That was a really inspiring conversation. Thank you, Caroline and Jeremy. Coaching is obviously more than performance management. It's about nurturing leaders who bring a purpose, they bring humanity, and they bring sustainability into everything they do. If you can think about one thing, how can coaching for yourself or your team bring your values and purpose to the forefront of leadership? That should be it. How can you really bring your values and purpose to the forefront of your leadership? Don't forget to subscribe to our Aziz podcasts. Visit our website, www.azizcorp.com. There are plenty more resources there, lots of insights and stories from our coaching community. Until the next time, goodbye.